China, the 19th century, a nation torn between dynasties and dreams, empires and ideology. While the world focused on colonial conquests and revolutions in Europe, a far more devastating conflict unfolded in the East, a war of faith, fire, and fanaticism that would leave tens of millions dead. It wasn't started by a general or a politician. It began with a failed exam taker who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ. This is the story of the Taiping Rebellion, the deadliest civil war in human history, and a conflict so vast it nearly brought down an empire. In this episode, we trace the rise of a radical kingdom, the clash between visions of salvation and imperial power, and the devastating toll on a nation that never fully recovered. But how could a man with a vision spark a rebellion that shook one of the world's oldest civilizations to its core? And why is it so often forgotten in the West? Join us as we journey into the heart of 19th century China to uncover the forgotten war that changed everything. To understand the Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest conflicts in world history, we must begin with the empire it sought to destroy. By the early 19th century, the Qing dynasty, once a symbol of order and power, was a giant stumbling under the weight of its own decay. The Qing, ruled by Manchu emperors since 1644, had long enforced stability across a vast, diverse territory. But by the 1830s, that order was unraveling. The empire's population had ballooned to over 400 million, a staggering number unmatched by any nation on Earth. But with this growth came scarcity. Land was exhausted, food supplies strained, and opportunities for social mobility were dwindling. A crucial ladder of advancement in Chinese society was the imperial examination system, a series of grueling tests that allowed scholars to rise to civil service. But with tens of thousands competing for just a few hundred positions, failure was almost inevitable. For the rural poor, especially the Hakka minority, failure meant a lifetime of hardship and humiliation. Among them was a man named Hong Xiuquan, but we'll return to him shortly. As internal pressures mounted, new forces arrived from beyond the sea. Western powers, Britain, France, and others, were increasingly interested in China's wealth, silk, and especially tea. But China had little interest in trade with the West, insisting on silver in exchange for goods. In response, Britain began exporting a product that would poison the empire from within: opium. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese, from peasants to soldiers, were addicted. The Qing government, alarmed by the moral and economic decay, cracked down, seizing and destroying shipments. Britain retaliated. The First Opium War erupted in 1839. China, ill-equipped and outdated militarily, was decisively defeated. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing forced China to cede Hong Kong and opened 5 treaty ports to foreign powers. It was a national humiliation, the first of many in what Chinese historians later called the Century of Humiliation. Across the countryside, the emperor's grip weakened. Banditry surged. Local militias replaced imperial troops in many regions. Entire provinces suffered famine, disease, and disillusionment. People began to lose faith in the Confucian ideals that had held society together for centuries. In their place, new ideologies, particularly Christian teachings, began to take root, especially among the marginalized Hakka. Missionaries, both foreign and Chinese, introduced Bibles, tracts, and radical ideas about equality, salvation, and divine justice. One such pamphlet would soon fall into the hands of a failed scholar and change the fate of China forever. In the backwater villages of southern China, the Hakka people lived on the margins, hard-working, restless, and often scorned by their Han neighbors. Among them was a boy born in 1814 in Guangdong province, in a village called Hong. His name was Hong Xiuquan. From a young age, Hong showed promise as a scholar. His family, though poor, saved all they could to ensure his success in the imperial exams. Success meant more than just honor. It was a ticket to the bureaucracy, to power, prestige, and security. For generations of Chinese men, it was the only dream worth chasing. But Hong failed, again and again. 4 times he sat for the exam. 4 times he returned in disgrace. After his 3rd failure in 1837, Hong fell gravely ill. In a feverish delirium, he claimed to be taken to a heavenly realm. There, a golden-bearded father and a younger brother in a dragon robe urged him to cleanse the world of demons. He awoke weeks later, weakened, but changed. At first, his visions were a mystery even to himself. But years later, after failing the exam yet again, Hong received a Christian tract from a local missionary. As he read, the truth struck him like lightning. The golden-bearded figure in his dream, God, the Heavenly Father, the younger brother, Jesus Christ. Hong Xiuquan now believed he was the younger brother of Jesus, divinely chosen to purge China of corruption and false idols. Hong began preaching a unique blend of Protestant Christianity, Chinese tradition, and personal revelation. He denounced Confucianism, idol worship, and the Qing dynasty, which he called a demonic regime ruled by foreign devils, referring to their Manchu origins. His message resonated deeply with the poor, the oppressed, and especially the Hakka. He preached equality, abolishment of foot binding, shared land ownership, and the rejection of social hierarchies. In a rigidly stratified society, these ideas were revolutionary. By the late 1840s, Hong's movement had grown into a religious political force. Along with 3 key lieutenants, Yang Xiuqing, Feng Yunshan, and Xiao Chaogui, he formed the God-worshipping society. Together, they began to build not just a congregation, but an army. Converts were trained as soldiers, villagers were transformed into militants. They wore their hair long, in defiance of the Manchu queue required by Qing law, and adopted strict religious codes. Women fought alongside men. Commanders took no concubines. Every soldier was a believer. In 1851, on the slopes of Thistle Mountain, Hong proclaimed a new era. He declared himself the Heavenly King and the founder of the Taiping Rebellion, the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. What had begun as a vision in a sickbed was now a full-scale rebellion. Hong Xiuquan was no longer just a failed scholar. He was a prophet, a monarch, a revolutionary messiah. In 1851, the spark was lit. A rebellion unlike any other in Chinese history exploded into the open. What began as a religious awakening now marched as a righteous army, bent on purging sin and overthrowing an empire. On January 11th, 1851, Hong Xiuquan's 38th birthday, he declared the start of a holy war. Thousands of followers of the God-worshipping society were now part of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, their enemy, the Qing dynasty. Their goal, to rid China of Manchu rule, idolatry, inequality, and corruption. At first, Qing authorities dismissed the rebels as a minor disturbance in the southern provinces, but they underestimated both the fervor and the strategy of the Taiping. The new kingdom quickly evolved into a formidable military machine. Taiping troops were organized into strict regiments, with 13,000-man divisions, each with embedded preachers and moral enforcers. Discipline was brutal. Looting and sexual misconduct were punished by execution. They advanced with religious chants and flags bearing heavenly symbols, crosses, suns, flames, proclaiming the dawn of a new divine order. Hong's closest lieutenants were not just generals. They were prophets in their own right. Yang Xiuqing, a former charcoal seller, claimed to speak with God's voice. His word became law among the faithful. Under this fiery leadership, the Taiping swept through Guangxi and into Hunan province, gathering converts, defeating local Qing garrisons, and growing by the tens of thousands. In 1852, the Taiping captured Yong'an and moved northward along the Xiang River. With every victory, their momentum surged. The common people, long oppressed by taxes, warlords, and famine, saw hope in the heavenly kingdom. In town after town, officials fled, idols were smashed, temples burned, the Bible replaced Confucian texts. New laws were imposed, based on a fusion of Mosaic commandments and Hong's own revelations. By 1853, the rebellion had grown into a tidal wave, nearly 1 million strong. The Taiping forces surged north, bypassing strongholds, striking where Qing defenses were weakest. And then came the greatest prize of all. In March of 1853, the Taiping army reached Nanjing, the ancient capital of multiple Chinese dynasties. After a brutal siege, the city fell. Tens of thousands of Manchu bannermen were slaughtered. It was not just a military victory, it was symbolic. The Taiping had seized the soul of China. Hong Xiuquan renamed it Tianjing, the heavenly capital. In Tianjing, the Taiping set about constructing their utopia. Land was redistributed. Alcohol, opium, and prostitution were banned. Men and women lived separately. Civil administration was handled by a new sacred bureaucracy. To the outside world, it was something never seen before, a Chinese Christian theocracy waging total war against a Confucian imperial order. But even as the Taiping celebrated, trouble brewed within. Their momentum masked growing tensions. Their righteous flame would soon be dimmed, not just by Qing cannons, but by betrayal, ego, and blood from within their own ranks. Nanjing, once the seat of imperial glory, now stood in ashes and judgment. The Taiping had taken it by sword and declared it sacred. They called it Tianjing, the heavenly capital. In March 1853, the Taiping victory at Nanjing marked a turning point in the rebellion and in Chinese history. What had been a nomadic army of believers was now a government, with a throne, a capital, and a mission to remake the world. Hong Xiuquan, the failed scholar turned prophet, was now the heavenly king. His word became divine law, and Tianjing was to be the center of a holy empire stretching across all of China. He withdrew from public view, living in seclusion inside a sprawling palace complex. He claimed to speak only with God and issued edicts through intermediaries. Daily governance was left to his top commanders: Yang Shuqing, the self-proclaimed voice of God; Wei Changhui, the North King; Shi Dakai, a brilliant young general, and several others who formed the inner court. In the streets, Taiping reforms were swift and sweeping. Confucian texts were banned. Idols and ancestral shrines were destroyed. Men and women were segregated into different quarters. Marriages were arranged and closely monitored. Gambling, opium, alcohol, all forbidden. The Bible became the guiding document of state, interpreted through Hong's unique theology, blending Protestant ideas with ancient Chinese concepts and his own visions. The Taiping also introduced radical social reforms. Land was to be shared equally. Wealth was communal. Women could serve in the military, own property, and even hold rank, rare in Chinese history. To the poor and the devout, Tianjing was paradise. To the skeptical, it was rigid, joyless, and terrifying. Yet beneath the grandeur of the heavenly capital, cracks were already forming. The very men who had fought side by side in battle now jockeyed for power. Yang Shuqing, the most powerful of Hong's deputies, claimed he could speak with God directly and issue commands in the divine voice. He often summoned other leaders and rebuked them in the name of heaven. Even the heavenly king himself was not exempt. Hong, increasingly isolated and paranoid, tolerated Yang's authority, but only for a time. In 1856, Yang's ambition crossed a fatal line. He requested the title of 10,000-year king, a designation only ever used by emperors. Hong, fearing a coup, struck preemptively. He ordered Yang assassinated, hacked to pieces by guards inside the palace. But the purge did not end there. Two of Yang's rivals, Wei Changhui and Qin Rigang, went further, massacring Yang's family and followers by the thousands. The streets of Tianjin ran red with blood. The movement that had promised heavenly peace now turned on itself with hellish fury. Shidakai, one of the most respected generals, condemned the purge and fled the capital with tens of thousands of loyal troops, weakening the Taiping military just as external threats were growing. The heavenly kingdom still stood, but it was no longer united. From within, ambition had bred betrayal, and from without, the Qing and their foreign allies were preparing to strike back. The heavenly kingdom had taken a capital, but it had lost its soul. After the bloodshed of 1856, the Taiping leadership was no longer united in faith, only in fear. The execution of Hong Xiuquan and the internal purge fractured the very leadership that had powered the Taiping's miraculous rise. Hong Xiuquan, the heavenly king, retreated deeper into seclusion, issuing increasingly erratic proclamations, many written in childish script. He focused more on theology and prophecy than governance or military strategy. With the movement's spiritual leader in retreat, its military suffered. Shidakai, perhaps the most competent of all the Taiping commanders, had fled Tianjin after denouncing the palace bloodshed. He took tens of thousands of soldiers and began his own campaign in the west. Although he remained nominally loyal to the Taiping cause, his departure split their military might, just as the Qing were beginning to regroup. For years, the Qing dynasty had reeled from the rebellion's early victories. But now, with new leadership, they struck back. Key to the Qing resurgence were local armies, raised not by the central government but by regional elites. In Hunan, a scholar named Zheng Guofan began to organize a disciplined militia known as the Xiang Army. Trained in Western tactics and armed with modern weapons, Zheng's forces were not just effective, they were zealous. Unlike the corrupt Qing bureaucracies in Beijing, Zheng's army was motivated by Confucian revivalism and a deep sense of patriotic duty. They began pushing south, retaking city after city. At the same time, the Qing gained unexpected allies, the Western powers. Britain and France, though initially intrigued by the Taiping's Christian rhetoric, found them unpredictable, even dangerous. Taiping policies had banned foreign trade, destroyed Buddhist and Taoist temples, and made little effort to engage with foreign diplomats. The Qing, by contrast, were willing to negotiate. After the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, Western powers received favorable treaties and commercial rights, making the Qing a more stable partner. The Taiping, who had once marched like fire through the empire, now stood isolated, surrounded by enemies and divided within. Despite this, opportunities remained. In 1856, a second Taiping army, led by generals Li Xiucheng and Chen Yucheng, began an ambitious northern campaign, aiming to capture Beijing and strike at the heart of Qing rule. If successful, they might have ended the dynasty. But the campaign faltered, coordination failed, supplies ran dry. Qing forces regrouped and countered. By 1857, the northern expedition collapsed. The Taiping armies returned south, exhausted and diminished. Tianjin remained the capital, but the dream of a sweeping nationwide victory was fading. Hong continued to issue proclamations, often filled with heavenly visions, dietary advice, and divine parables. His belief in his own divine role never wavered, but the world around him had changed. Cities that once welcomed the Taiping now resisted. Villages who once offered food and support now closed their gates. The movement had once promised equality, justice, and peace. Now it offered hardship, repression, and war. Missed opportunities, divided command, a kingdom rotting from within, while enemies gathered beyond its walls. The dream was not yet dead, but the storm was coming. It began as a whisper, rumors of armies assembling, of gunboats on the Yangtze, of cities falling one by one. By 1863, it was no longer a rumor. The Qing, with Western-trained armies and foreign weapons, were closing in on the heavenly capital. For over a decade, the Taiping had defied one of the world's oldest empires. Now, the dynasty had learned, adapted, and struck back. Zheng Guofan, the Confucian general scholar, and his protege Li Hongzhang led the Xiang and Hui armies in a brutal war of attrition. Western-trained mercenaries, including the infamous, ever-victorious army led by American Frederick Townsend Ward and later by British officer Charles Gordon, supported the Qing. City after city fell. The Taiping lost control of the Yangtze River, their key artery of transport and communication. Their armies, once numbering over 1 million, were now fragmented, exhausted, and starving. Inside Tianjin, desperation took hold. Food was scarce, disease spread, morale collapsed. The once grand capital, symbol of divine promise, became a city of ghosts. Hong Xiuquan, still in his palace, insisted that God would deliver victory. He sent letters to the faithful to pray harder, trust deeper. But heaven remained silent. In early 1864, Hong Xiuquan fell ill. Malnourished, isolated, and mentally frayed, he spent his last days writing religious tracts and searching scripture for divine rescue. On June 1st, 1864, he died. Most accounts say from food poisoning. Some say he starved. The heavenly king, the brother of Jesus, the man who had once commanded millions, died in silence. He was succeeded by his 15-year-old son, Hong Tianguifu, declared the young king. But the child could barely command a conversation, let alone an army. The burden of leadership crushed him instantly. In July 1864, Qing forces encircled Tianjin completely. They launched a massive assault on July 19th. Explosives ripped through the city's outer walls. Taiping defenders fought desperately. But the outcome was never in doubt. Street by street, house by house, the Qing advanced. The fall of Tianjin was not just military defeat, it was annihilation. Tens of thousands of Taiping fighters and civilians were slaughtered. Those who surrendered were often executed. Hong Xiuquan's body was exhumed, cremated, and his ashes blasted from a cannon to symbolically erase his soul from the earth. The heavenly kingdom was no more. In 13 years, it had risen from rural prayer meetings to controlling 1/3 of China. It had reshaped the political landscape, shaken an empire to its core, and caused a death toll that remains almost unfathomable. But its dream, a Christian utopia free from corruption and hierarchy, died with its king. Scattered Taiping remnants fought on for a few more years. Shida Kai had already surrendered in 1863 and was executed. Other rebel leaders fled or were hunted down. By 1866, the last organized resistance had ended. The Qing dynasty had survived, but it was hollowed out, reliant on regional armies and foreign alliances, weakened in authority and resources. China would never be the same. The fall of the heavenly kingdom marked the end of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Over 20 million people had died, more than in World War I. Cities were razed, rivers ran red, and a nation's soul was left fractured. But the Taiping Rebellion was more than blood and fire. It was a cry for justice, for transformation, a warning and a legacy still echoing through China's long and turbulent history. The cannons fell silent, the fires burned out, the banners of the heavenly kingdom vanished into smoke. But the Taiping Rebellion did not end with the fall of Tianjin. Its shadow lingered, in politics, in culture, and in the psyche of a wounded empire. The Qing dynasty had survived, but only barely. It emerged from the war drained of manpower, dependent on regional warlords, and humiliated by its reliance on foreign troops to crush a domestic uprising. In many ways, the Qing won the war and lost the future. Leaders like Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang became powerful symbols of a new kind of Chinese authority, regional, military, pragmatic, and deeply conservative. They championed self-strengthening, introducing Western technology, weapons, and diplomacy, while clinging tightly to Confucian values. But their reforms were too cautious, too slow, and too constrained by an empire afraid of change. No structural changes were made to prevent another rebellion of this scale. Land reform was avoided. Corruption remained rampant. And above all, the Qing failed to understand the spiritual hunger that had made the Taiping cause so potent. But what of the people who had followed the heavenly king? What of the dream that had stirred millions to rise up against the world as it was? For many, the Taiping were remembered not as heretics, but as martyrs. In rural areas ravaged by the war, oral traditions painted them as misunderstood heroes, fighting for justice, equality, and a better life. Their memory became especially important decades later, as a new generation of reformers and revolutionaries looked to China's past for inspiration. Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, saw the Taiping as early revolutionaries. Like them, he was Christian educated. Like them, he opposed the Manchu Qing dynasty. And like them, he believed China needed radical change. The Taiping vision, however flawed, had challenged centuries of imperial orthodoxy. It proved that rebellion on a vast scale was possible, and yet the Taiping legacy is deeply complex. They sought to replace one autocracy with another. Their rule in Tianjin was repressive and puritanical. Their movement, though built on spiritual hope, often resulted in destruction and fanaticism. Millions died not only in battle, but from famine, disease, and forced relocations. The Taiping War left scars on Chinese religion too. Entire generations of Buddhists and Taoists were wiped out in the south. Monasteries burned, statues smashed. Christianity, once hopeful in its alignment with the rebellion, became associated in China with foreign interference and internal chaos. Today, the Taiping Rebellion is both remembered and forgotten, remembered as the most devastating civil war in world history, and forgotten in global consciousness, overshadowed by more recent wars and revolutions. But its echoes are still with us. The questions it raised remain central. What is justice in a broken system? How do you balance faith and power? Can violent revolution ever build a peaceful future? These questions are not just Chinese, they are universal. The Taiping heavenly kingdom collapsed in flames, but the fire it lit has never truly gone out. It flickers in every dream of radical change, in every uprising born of belief and desperation, in every attempt to tear down an old world and build a new one. This was the Taiping Rebellion.